Hello, welcome. My name is Liz Harrison. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'll be speaking today about designing for today's hybrid delivery. So many of us are going back and forth between the real world and the online world as we ride these pandemic waves. So what I'm sharing here today is intended to help you and support you and not add anything more to your plate. Ideally, the session will take things off of your plate and hopefully help you sort through what might feel a bit extraneous at this stage. Please be empowered to pause, stop, take a break, revisit. My intention is to make some shorter breakout pieces available on my YouTube channel as you go through this session for Mighty Peace. If there are some things that you'd like to revisit, that's the plan. And I have shared some materials for free on my Teachers Pay Teachers page as well as through the Mighty Peace servers. So please feel free to take advantage of those and make those your own. Knowledge that I'm sharing in this presentation has been hard won. To understand where I'm coming from, I want to share with you a little bit of context. The lockdown was very hard. I have never had such a challenging time. I live on my own. My family lives far, far away, 12 hours in both directions. People spread all over the place. And even though I have a great community in the city that I live in, it was definitely a lot less visible in those times of separation and lockdown. So as I entered this year, I was still in some of that muck and mired down from some of those things that had happened. I had never had to ask for help in the ways that I had to ask for help this year, and that was really challenging. Even though I know, coming towards the lessons in the long run, I can see the growth that happened from that, but it didn't make it less hard, and I felt like I was still walking wounded in a lot of ways in September. So one of the things that I had shift my perspective were the students. When they came back, everybody was afraid. Everybody was worried that we were holding them accountable for what they did or didn't do in the lockdown. That was definitely not my jam. And so for them, I could see that when we sort of released them from some of those things that they were stressing out about, there was definitely a huge shift. And we started to have fun at school. What a concept, right? So for me, I still, even though good things were happening around me, I was struggling to focus and look for the good. At an interesting chiropractor appointment in which I complained the whole time. And by the end, I realized I had this moment of realization of what I sounded like. And I realized that the person that I appeared to be and the words that I was saying were not me. They were not my perspectives. They were coming from this very fear-based place. And so, it was a risk for me to decide that this year was going to be okay, even with the masking, even with the distancing, even with all the cleaning and all this uncertainty and, fear. And so when I had that realization, it changed what I was looking for. So one of the things that I've dug into in this transition to pandemic life is the coaching mindset. So what are the stories that we're telling ourselves about our lives? How are they serving us or not serving us? And what do they allow us to focus on or look for? So this is where some of the shift came from me. I went backwards a little bit and remembered some of the values work that I had done with my department. And Brene Brown, Dare to Lead, if you haven't taken a look, she's got an excellent process and approach and a very simple practice in which you start with a huge list of personal values and then you eliminate. So it might be crossing off half to start out with, but the point is to get down to two and two only, because as they say, I can't remember who, but as people say, if you have more than two priorities, you have no priorities. And so two priorities is the goal. And for me, my priorities, which I had learned about myself pre-pandemic, were community and culture. It's important to me to build groups that are connected and supportive of each other. I have been on the outside of groups, I have been on the inside of groups, and I have been brought into groups with different places that I've lived over my life. And I can feel the difference when you are in a room or a classroom where a community exists versus where it does not, or it's still in the inception stages. So I definitely wanted to bring that sense of collective connectedness to my classes. And culture is my other value. So how do we do things? How do we feel with the way that we do things? How do things work around here? That's a key thing for me generally in the best of times, but in the worst of times, I really was able to sort of hyper focus in and decide what was the most important. Did it align with these two values? Any choice that I made in my classroom and with my students was filtered through these two lenses. And so that really helped me decide what's the most important thing here and what can I let go of. So the third piece is the maverick culture. the school that I teach at, we are the Mavericks, and we take risks, we help each other, we support each other. Our three pillars are to connect, to belong, and to celebrate. And so those are other lenses that I use as I'm thinking about the things that are the most important and where we should spend our time. No one of those is more important than the other, although I have to say this year, celebrate for me has been huge. Celebrate accomplishment, celebrate connection, celebrate when we're together, when we return to be together again. Celebration is something that might feel a bit hard to find right now, especially because we've got so many rules about you can't have weddings or funerals even together. So these times of happiness and grief that we gather are off the table. So as much as I can, where I can, when I can, it's something that I'm looking for and looking to build into what I do with students. All right. So the last thing that's on this slide, you'll see there's a graphic. Part of my commitment to community and culture is coming from a school that I did a practicum in my very early student teaching, and they followed the Seattle Pike Place Market fish philosophy. So if you haven't heard of it, imagine in Seattle, it's this fish market, and your job all day is to throw fish, slimy, smelly fish, well, probably not smelly, but slimy fish back and forth, and they're frozen, and it's cold, and it's hard work, and it's scaly, and, gross. But if you go there, it's a huge tourist attraction because they have so much fun. They make it fun. They play. They toss the fish. They make them talk. They do all kinds of performative things for the crowds that now gather to watch this fun job. A crazy, crazy thing because, who wants to come and see the fish market? And yet they've found a way to really make it special and make it worth the time. So these are the 4 pieces of their philosophy that I try to use and frame the choices and actions that I'm making. I'm always going back to my community and culture values, but these align with them so beautifully. So play is going to save us this year. We need play like never before. Learning as play actually creates a lot more success, and you can make leaps and bounds in ways that you might normally take a lot of time to get that flex and build that muscle. So play can be awesome, very experimental for sure. Making their day, this does not have to be big. This can be a small gesture or remembering a student's name who's behind a mask who, nobody has said hi to them that day. One of the most important things that I did in my day this year was to connect with a student in my last class of the day who lost a parent to cancer just as the pandemic was starting up. So that on top of moving to a new city, on top of masks and not having a lot of connections in the school that were positive and going forward and feeling like they were giving support, that was the most important thing I did in the day. And it was about making their day and being there. So be there. When you're there, be present. I feel like this year now I'm living more in the moment than I ever have before. And it's good. It's a good thing. I mean, we're not done planning for the future, but today is now, and we might as well enjoy it because it could be another lockdown tomorrow where we might, run out of the chocolate stash if we're in lockdown now. So you might as well enjoy the day. So one of the things that I learned was, and learned to let go, was the plans. What my plans were looking like as we were in the pandemic lockdown is what you can see here. Look at this page. If you're a student, what's important? We don't know. So it became more of a barrier. It created a lot of frustration for students and for parents as well. And as we went into this new year, I thought, okay, I want to revamp that a little bit, but I still stayed with that weekly plan. So my idea was that students who were at home would be able to check in and have a sense of what we were doing. But the reality is that wasn't meeting the needs of connecting with the students individually. It was putting something out there that may or may not be actively accessed. So it was a lot of work for me. It created a passive touch base point that didn't really communicate or serve the effective functions that I wanted it to. So you can see, even though I committed to this plan for the first semester with all of those lesson plans and readings, and there's lots of great information in there and lots of beautiful planning, what it was used for was pretty much nothing. It did not serve the function for my students or the parents that I intended it to. So if you haven't heard this yet, you're already doing your best. This is a pandemic. This is a crazy time to try to learn how to teach online. In the best of times, that would be a challenge. And now in this, version of our reality, it's probably adding a lot of stress. And we could be spending hours and days and months generating materials that never support student learning the way we intend. So you're already doing your best, but what I'm hoping to share are a few switches that I discovered that you can use to sort of let go of some of these perfect versions that look really beautiful if an administrator is looking at them and actually don't look anything like help for students. So this is something that I gave myself permission to let go of. Towards the end of the first semester, I decided, okay, is this building community? Is this creating culture and giving a clear sense of how we do things here? It was not. And so what I ended up doing instead, I've switched over now for the semester to a much more functional plan. I'm living in reality. Whatever students are needing, it's mostly connection and directions from me. The idea that they're going to passively go and read is a beautiful idea. And I know as an adult, I'm taking some courses through distance learning as well. And I have the ability to do that. But I also have a fair bit of educational experience and history and background and the university understanding of we go to class for a short amount of time, but that's not all we do in the week for that class. So there's all kinds of things that students are not yet experts with. And so because of that, they need some support and also some help navigating some of these supports that we plan for them. So my goal here was to create functional plans that I would use in my teaching and instruction that students could also track with, access, and tune in for daily. So to do this, I had to get really familiar with my platforms. I'm using Google Classroom in most places. I also am very fluent in Teams, but those are the two platforms that my school district is using for the most part. But I'll share a little bit later. There are some pros and cons to choosing one platform versus to learn how platforms work and then transfer that skills as needed to other areas. So what my plans look like these days are daily updates, little short messages that I can write just as class is starting. And often now, because we have so many students who are out on directed absence, who are needing to stay home and isolate for a time, I try to have a Google Meet if I have those students out, set for about half an hour, 45 minutes into the class, whenever it would make sense that other students have been giving instructions. They are now off and running. And now, okay, you've had some things to take a look at. And now those of you at home, if you have questions or you need some clarification on the instructions, now here we have time to talk. So I know that's not the right fit for everybody. Very, lots of concerns about how we're using our time and where that should be directed. But I'm teaching for reality. The reality is not everyone's in the room. Not everybody would not want to be in the room. And so I want to empower students who are trying to stay on top of things and do their best in unforeseen circumstances at difficult times to make that connection and have some consistency there. The other thing is, in that block of time, that is my time dedicated for them. So if I have that available when I'm meeting with the whole class, that eliminates any need to make meets happen at lunchtime or after school or outside of school hours. Students then have more equitable access, barring any internet and tech deficiencies at home. The idea is that they would have access to the teacher just as they would if they were in the class at that time. So that's something that's really worked for me. It's a nice boundary that I've set as well, because I don't want to be, answering a million emails at 4:30 or trying to have a phone call with a student that's just freaking out and really not sure about something and they're having a lot of stress. The other thing that this starts to look like, it gets quite long, as you can see. So my daily updates here as we went through a project over a number of weeks, I started copying and pasting and adding this to a Google slideshow so that they could see what the instructions for the previous days looked like. Most students didn't access that, but it was helpful for me. So as a quick screen capture, quick copy and paste, or on your Mac, Shift Command 3 to print screen. And what that allowed me to do was just to remember what is it that they have missed, so I could go back through and help make sure that there were no gaps. You can see that there's quite a few documents here. These were not all added at the beginning. When we started this project, I had added this first Google Doc where I was adding journal entries and instructions as we went through them. But along with those, there are links to examples that I've added in there. There are highlights for new journal entries. It began with a title and one journal entry, so students could see how that got built over time and weren't overwhelmed coming in 2 weeks from now and seeing this end product and not knowing where to start. So as we were all online in the wintertime, Christmas, I guess, I was making sure that I could use these resources and have students find them easily, but I was also adding them on the days that we were using them. So they weren't loaded in there, a week in advance and then they had to navigate. We were navigating together and I would use attendance to connect with them and then we would take a look and I would give instructions. If I remembered to record those directions, that was also helpful. That mostly didn't happen. But you can see when we were ready to take a look at a video, instead of trying to play it through my screen and having the bandwidth suffer or having sound issues, I could load the link and say, okay, we're going to take a look at this in 10 minutes. I want you to come back or come back to your breakout rooms and talk about it. So some really nice structures there for students. And on days where I wanted us to have more of a conversation, I actually was able to add a Jamboard so that they could take a look and share their ideas after they had had some time to talk in their breakout rooms. So a lot of things, a lot of tools here, and you can see what they look like in my plan, but you can also see the difference between what I started with and where I left off after all of this extensive research and living through this reality that I was planning for and not really functioning in very. So, some of my research around culture pre pandemic, but very useful now that we're in the thick of things, is related to the different types of cultures that appear in classrooms. So, usually we start a new class and we have students come in, and it's never the same group twice most of the time. And so, we begin usually in shallow culture. We have a sense of who the individuals are in the room. We might have a leader emerge from the masses, but most of the time we start out as very separate. Maybe a few people have a buddy to sit beside that they know, but most students are not familiar with each other individually, maybe if you're in a large school, or even as a group if you haven't had a class that moves forward consistently, like a French immersion group together. So shallow culture is not a bad place to start. There's a lot of opportunity there. One thing to watch for, though, is if you start out and you're not sure, you might be in shark infested culture. So shallow culture and shark infested can look fairly similar at the very beginning. And there's a few things to look for to see where you're at. So shark infested may not be apparent in those first few weeks as everybody's on their best behavior, but you can look for competition. So is there a sense of one-upsmanship or competitive spirit that has a little dark side to it that's showing up for your students? Are they separating into us versus them groups in class conversations? If you had a debate, who is working against the others, or can there be balanced conversation and we wait for one person who has the floor to finish before we share an idea or take a turn? So shark infested is a little bit of a tricky one, especially with being online. If you're in shark infested culture, it might not be safe for people to have their cameras on. They might not feel comfortable to share their ideas in such an isolating way, meaning that you're speaking out with your voice and everybody else can hear you. And it's quite a platform in a way that a classroom doesn't often highlight that individual the same way. So shark infested is a little bit trickier to move away from. If you're finding this culture is existing in your classroom, especially online, what I'd suggest is if it's possible, find ways for students to take steps closer to each other. It's really hard to hate people close up, as Brene Brown says. And by getting curious, sometimes you can bypass those judgments. Not always. So there are some times where the groups are so competitive, so shark infested, it's so unsafe for students to share that I have gone to more individual work for the whole, maybe not for the whole semester, but certainly while we're online. If it's not a place to share ideas and feel safe and comfortable, then it's probably not something that I will lean heavily on or try to require of students, because I already know that that's not going to feel safe or comfortable for them. So shallow culture, you can definitely move into a deeper culture or deep culture. This is, my ideal shift is that a class, I do things that can help them see each other for who they are and come together. A lot of story sharing, a lot of, oh, that happened to you too. I had no idea. Oh, you broke a bone as well. Like all these kinds of histories that we don't see at face value. But it does take some time and investment. You have to make space for conversation, make space for students to connect without teacher intervention. So definitely an interesting place to go. But if you can make it into deep culture or even deepen your culture, what you'll find is that students feel comfortable to share. Students can ask for and offer help. That's a real sign of deep culture. If I'm only ever able to offer help and I can never ask for it, I have no ability to show any kind of weakness. And in that case, if I can only offer help, that means that the other person shouldn't show weakness and ask for it either. So we create a lot of permissions when we model these behaviors for students. It's not a bad thing to say, hey, I can't make my tech work. Anybody have a suggestion? This is what my screen looks like. Sometimes they fix everything. It's magical. So some metrics to assess culture. If I ask a question, what happens? Is the classroom silent? Is everybody looking at each other and waiting for the person who will talk or avoiding making eye contact? Are we able to have a conversational response, meaning somebody can answer and someone else can reply and engage and a conversation flows? Maybe we're listening to each other and waiting for our turn to speak and share. Maybe we are making sure that the person who has something to say, who's been overlooked, gets their turn. So asking a question can be really interesting and revealing. If I ask a question and only one student who I directly ask that question to is comfortable to respond and only responds to me, shark infested culture, most likely, or very shallow at this stage. So it's definitely a very revealing process. This does not necessarily translate the same way online. Of course, we don't know what's happening behind all these screens. And so this may not be your best metric if you're starting the class online, but a really great bypass is to start with some storytelling and sharing low risk questions, low risk stories, but things that will help people get comfortable. Have you ever thrown up in public is a great question. Start with that and see what people have to say. Make sure you have a story too. Don't ask them to share if you are not going to model that vulnerability and courage first as well. Our default setting. This is a tough one. I love to ask the question, would you say generally people are doing their best? And I know I've mentioned her twice already, but Brene Brown is the inceptor of this idea. The idea being, if we think that we are already doing our best, we can also extend that possibility and perspective to people around us. And if we think that they are not doing their best, often it's because we feel the same way about ourselves. So this is a really interesting thing to explore, especially in an online class. Having students who are willing to help each other out with tech is a really great place to start. So, feel free to sit back and not be so quick to help solve those problems, because you might have students who emerge as these culture leaders in the classroom and want to help out each other. And even students who are asking for that help are showing that vulnerability and willingness to connect. If the cameras are on, you're in deep culture. That is magical. And if you can, there's a few things you can do to encourage students to bring their cameras. This is one of my favorite weird little dollar store purchases from this year. But I had all kinds of fun little props and just things that we could share in the background, or things that, maybe my attendance question was, okay, show me something with a cheetah on it. Go find something. So a lot of ways to just sort of make students feel more comfortable, even if they're just turning their camera on for a moment to say hi. That's awesome. That makes them that's awesome. They are then, extending that possibility for connection, and they'll probably get more and more comfortable as time goes on. So something to keep in mind, if it's not happening at the beginning, it doesn't mean it's never going to happen. All right, so some of the ways that I have created classroom culture for both online and in-person courses, especially this year as we're going back and forth between the two, I try to use attendance as a way to really engage. So, strange questions work wonders. You can do low-risk ones like, what is your perfect breakfast? Or a superpower or body modification you'd like to try. Maybe it's talking about a dish your family cooks, but avoid yes or no questions as much as possible. There should be something that you are asking students to give you back in return to create that engagement and connection. I love to share visuals, weird pictures, weird, funny little, dollar store purchases, or the things that happen to be in my home office as I was working from home. Work wonders for sure. And I did have a magical student who showed up dressed up in a different costume every day, who was in my cosmetology and English classes. And she brought so much fun. She actually influenced other students to take those same risks and start wearing some interesting things. I have to say, I really enjoyed the dangly earrings as we were online, because you can't wear those with the masks. I learned very quickly when I tried to one day. So things like that are low risk and creating that connection, they're not time wasted, that's for sure. I prioritize play. I tried to make some things, those hunts and those props and time to talk, things that don't feel like school, but feel like, okay, our class is just sitting down and things are getting started, and here's the conversations and chatting that would happen. So, that doesn't have to go away just because we're online. Yes, our time is dedicated in different ways, but that's my priority. That's my value, community, culture. I want to take the time for those things because I know what they do in the long run for kids. I like to remind them, you belong with us. And I had a few students that I had to both physically in person and digitally online hunt down for connection. There was one in particular who had an afternoon class with me, and I would see his attendance for the morning. He'd be in the building and then somehow not make it to my class. And so I actually went to his second block class 3 times. And the third time I said, I can't come and do this again. I need you to start showing up. But he came to class. He started coming to class, and he recognized that, I wanted him there to the point that I was willing to come and seek him out and make that happen. Same thing for a student who I knew was out there somewhere on the internet floating in the universe, but was never showing up to our Google Meets. And so I had a Google Meet with them individually at lunch, and I chatted with the mom, and we made some moves so that she could gracefully rejoin the class as she was ready. And we chose a day that was really a nice conversational day, not a end of the assignment, finish up the work kind of a day, so that she could rejoin and not feel like she was behind or set up for failure. I model looking for the good. That's a really hard thing, but what a lesson that I've learned this year, as I shared. So, what is good? What is happening around us that is awesome right now that we can enjoy, that we can, be mindful of and notice, so that we remember this day as being a happy one. Choose when to be transparent. I don't need to hustle. I don't need to make it look easy. These are kids, and they need to see the struggle. They need to understand that that's okay and part of things and life, and this is what it will be sometimes. But that doesn't make people give up. It's not the end. It's the thing that will help us learn and grow. And so if I'm, transparent and authentic about the hard things that are happening for me, I create permission for them to do the same. And I remind them to make choices that feel safe about what they want to share and how they want to share it and who they want to share it with. So breakout rooms, what I use them for is definitely a bit different than what many of my colleagues use them for. There are quite a few apps about how to use these. There are different Google extensions that we've tried. I didn't have a lot of luck making breakout rooms that I could then join the students in and access and sort of move back and forth fluidly with. So what I ended up doing was just making breakout rooms, and I asked students to tell me, their friend groups I had a sense of already, so I put them with the people I thought they'd want to be with. And so they could join a breakout room and have a conversation as they would in a classroom without a teacher hovering there. It's not natural for us to hear everything and listen to everything and be tuned into every single interaction that happens in the room. It's not authentic. It's not realistic. And so, help doesn't necessarily show up or become apparent when I'm around all the time. So one of the things that I've created for this presentation is a graphic to unpack this idea of containers to hold learning. Often we go again and again to the well of writing, and the reality is a lot of writing nowadays is left, as they say, on the cutting room floor. For example, even in this presentation, had I scripted everything out for myself, most of the time as we start filming, some of that is left behind, and most of it you don't see. And so with that, it's not that writing becomes less significant, but it's not the container that is most frequently used nowadays in a lot of ways. It also is something that may act as a barrier for some students. So I'm thinking about the 30 level classes that students need for high school diploma earning in Alberta. If you come to the end and you haven't taken an options class 10, 20, 30, you may end up in a 30 class that has no prerequisite, but it might be law 30, or it might be something that sociology 30, something that you haven't necessarily thought of as a non-academic type of class. So even classes that appear to be very academic and very reading heavy can be modified for the containers that are used more frequently today. speaking and representing or presenting as I'm doing here is definitely, maybe not the wave of the future. The English teacher in me rejects the idea that reading and writing is over. It's definitely not. But a lot of the times those containers can become a barrier, especially in a year where we're not able to give as detailed or in-depth instruction or one-to-one feedback as frequently as we might in other years. So to understand this graphic, what I would suggest you think about is starting with this idea of the top and the bottom. So the top is the learning zone. It's the inhale. It's the materials that we take in, the mentor pieces that we look at and consider. It's not a passive inhale. There's definitely a lot of action that happens with reading, viewing, and listening, understanding what it is that we're seeing on the page or on the screen, understanding how to unpack that, understanding how an author has created those things, or text creator has created those things. But it's very definition heavy. It's that lower part of the Bloom's taxonomy where you're thinking about knowledge and understanding and application, understanding the theory, understanding the broad concepts, but you might not yet at this stage have an innate understanding of how to then create those things yourself. So often we have, I think about, social. I definitely in high school had a wonderful social teacher, but so much of my job was to sit and listen. And a lot of the time, that didn't happen because my attention was wandering somewhere else because I wanted to talk instead. And that's still true today. So if we think about a lot of the times the inhale, in some classes might have a very heavy emphasis on that inhale and very little emphasis on the exhale or that growth zone. So imagine if back in the day I had been allowed to speak in social. I have lots of ideas about all kinds of things and many opinions. And so I probably would have liked to talk for a long time, and maybe my social teacher did as well. But maybe we were sort of ships passing in the night, missing the point of that, right? If we're both talking and nobody's listening, well, what are we solving? And so if we think about how we might use these containers, think about the top zone as what we might take in or consider. But the top zone is what we generate and create in the bottom, in the exhale. So if we're reading the great work of a text creator, we should then be thinking about how are we writing about this work? How might we borrow from what they have created and done and use in our own ways? Same thing for if we're viewing something, what are we then creating that is a visual container? What can we show in a way that's not focused on only written response, but maybe allows students to visually represent their ideas or make connections in a more visual or even a physical way? Same thing for the listening speaking. There's room for that instructional guidance and those wonderful lectures. But if I never get to talk and I never get to share my sides of things, that's a tough sell. And it also doesn't necessarily help me understand how to do the thing that you're showing me that you're great at. So take me into that experience, show me the nuts and bolts, and have me go through that same process of development. And here I've come away from your class with a very different level of understanding, not just of the content and the topic, but also of the execution of this subject area. So in the learning zone, we go from this usually point of fear, especially this year as students came back and hadn't written anything in the pandemic. They were shaking in their shoes a little bit about, how do I do this? Am I way behind? Have I, ruined my life? Am I failing forever? And they forget that, no, it just takes some time and some muscle building. So generally what comes at the very beginning of understanding a subject is some interest, but maybe some intimidation as well. We might think, okay, I can never do that. Well, we haven't yet, but doesn't mean that we can never could. So once we move past that first layer of intimidation or fear, and it can be a big layer, especially if you're a grade 11 student in a -2 class and you haven't had a successful mark on a writing assignment since grade 5. How do we get past that, right? Confidence building might be the key step at the beginning. Once we move past that first initial stage of intimidation, we start to build muscles. This is not fun yet. This is not, I'm great at this thing and it all comes together and look at what I've created. This looks like a mess. And what am I even doing here? And what's the point of this? And, how did you do that? So there's a lot of muddiness, a lot of grit and grinding things out and going through the process of building the muscles that can come soon after we get past that fear. What I try to have students do is bypass as quickly as possible those first two stages to do an initial thing that'll help them get into the flow or the point of what it is we're doing. So if I know that in the long run our assignment is going to be a speech, I might have them start with a 30-second introduction to their neighbor about themselves. I might go from there to ask the class, hey, were there any amazing people that we want to hear from? Maybe you could share for a minute about what you guys talked about. We can scaffold up so that they get a sense and a taste of why this will be fun and useful in the long run without having to stay in that flex stage for a really long time. The flow will get better and easier and more quickly accessible with the flex work. So often once we are in learning about a process or about how to execute something, we're going back and forth between the flex and the flow. And the flow is the fun part. That's where we want to stay. I love this. I could just, speak forever about this topic. Oh, don't make me visually represent it. I don't want to do that. It's too hard. I haven't figured that out yet. I have to do more flex work before it becomes fun. So finding ways to sort of bridge that back and forth between the flex and flow is a great way to go. And the end result of the flow is not going to be the same for every student. It will depend on where they've come from and what they've come through, and also what they're willing to do flex-wise to build those muscles. So at the other end here in the growth zone, if we think about what we're aiming for in the long run, this is not about what we want students to execute for the mark in class. This is about, in the long run, who they are and can become as learners and members of society. So can they learn through this process to create, to see that, oh, I could never do that. Man, how did you ever figure out how to do that or make that? Doesn't have to be the place that you live forever. You can start to unpack and you can go through the process of learning how to do the thing and recognizing that, yeah, you don't have the expertise today, but it's not the end. Today is not over. So having that sense of possibility and the ability to believe that they can create is a huge piece that comes from this kind of practice. Communication definitely is going to be improved, especially if we're thinking about these different 6 strands. So I am coming from an English language arts perspective, and we have the 6 strands that we work with: read, view, listen, write, represent, speak. But they translate into all subject matters. This is why English is such a big subject, is that our topics and content can be all kinds of things, but our execution is everywhere. It comes into play in all other subjects as well. We read in every subject, we view and listen in every subject. And so these skills in English transfer all over the place and can be used to teach different subjects and also to measure success and hold learning products for other classes as well. So learning how to communicate and share your ideas is core in English, but it's also part of the curriculum for every other subject matter. And what the containers look like might have these foundations, even if it's a lab report in science or an experiment in biology. You might have to read through, and then you might have to speak about what you've learned by the end. So these foundational skills transfer and communication is really a theme across the board. Finally, the last piece of that growth zone graphic there, empathize. If we can, listen to others and read others' work and view others' work, we might build empathy for who they are. But how do we build empathy and understanding from them to us? We have to be able to share our own stories. We have to be able to have, authentic audiences that engage us and challenge us and make us feel afraid for a minute and then do it anyways. So all of these pieces can really help students understand how they might reveal their learning and also how they might share who they are with the world around them. All right, so how is this graphic applied? There's lots of ways you can do it. You can take a look at those fringe skills and think about, okay, what do I want students to inhale and what do I want them to exhale? Are there pieces of flex and flow that I want us to go back and forth between so that we can see how the, structures of the thing that we're trying to execute work? We can also take a look in the center and think about that Bloom's taxonomy sort of phase or process. I borrowed heavily from graphic design ideation processes as well. I'm taking some graphic design courses, hence the graphics. And so you can see that along with Bloom's, there is a process of development that happens when you're thinking about how to make a product that fits a particular need from a company. and then can deliver that access to a user or customer. So with the process that's listed off in the middle there, you can follow it from the top, which would be that base sort of section of blooms with the things you need to know to understand the foundations of the content area, definitions, the language, some of the broad concepts or applications. In the middle, this ideation stage is where we start to conceptualize and take this stuff apart. So when we are working through that ideation process, we might have lots of ideas. It's not the time to eliminate possibilities. So remove the instinct to edit and filter in favor of going forward to that prototyping and experimenting stage. That's where you can really start to see, how is this going to work? How will this function? Is the product I'm making the thing that I want it to be? How can I continue to edit and develop my design? So you often go back and forth between ideation, prototyping, and getting some ideas or some feedback from your audience, because it's not a one-way linear action. Idea of how can we make the most of being together again? And I decided, and this was maybe a little controversial for other people to see, but I decided that some of the time that I had in the block, I was going to dedicate to going outside to walk and talk. And I know not every curriculum supports this, but 1/6 of my curriculum is about speaking, and 1/6 is about listening. So this idea that we could go and do this nice outdoor, safely unmasked and distanced activity and get to know each other was revolutionary, and yet really in keeping with the spirit of my curriculum and what I wanted us to create for our community. So I knew that was my focus, and I knew that was the priority. So I made time for them as much as we could. Every day the weather permitted, we were outside walking and talking. And very quickly, those students who didn't have a person to walk and talk with were scooped up, and they found a person, or they found a group, or they were brought into one. And so that was building our community right from there. And we would come back from these walks and the conversation would continue. So it was really something special to see as these relationships develop. I also, as we got towards, the numbers are rising, we might be at home, I suggest that they get phone numbers and contact information for their new friends. And I was surprised at how many students hadn't done that on their own. These are skills they maybe haven't ever had to use if they've never moved to a new city. And it was something that they just needed some space for and some support and reminder to do. And here we had this whole layer of connection. So the walk and talks were not the point of this project. The point was to get up and speak in front of the class, but to speak about the thing they knew for sure already, not something they had to become an expert in and then present or muddle through, but their sport, their passion, the things that are on the walls of their room, the thing they want to do for their career out of high school, or what they would do for free forever because it's that much fun for them. So we had quite a range, such an interesting gamut of things came in for sure. I had students who wanted to talk about their sport and skiing, and I had students who wanted to talk about cooking and all kinds of different activities, art and collections and travel. And I helped them figure out what kind of visual artifacts they could include. So I suggested as much as we could to have a completely visual presentation. Don't add words first. We end up, we have all sat through those presentations where they're reading off the slide the whole time and it's painful for everybody. So if your, skill that you're trying to develop here is to speak, do you really need to have all those words on your slide to help you speak about the thing you love? You know this thing inside and out. So give yourself visuals that remind you what you want to say, but that don't hold you to a story or require you to read right off the slide. So that right off the bat was developing that speaking skill and secondary representation skill where they were choosing their visuals. We were not yet a class. We were in class together, but we didn't necessarily have a classroom culture developed that made me feel sure that we were in deep culture. I wasn't sure if we were in shallow or if we were in shark-infested culture. I had a class the year before that was definitely filled with sharks, and they're wonderful sharks, but they're so competitive it can be a little bit intimidating for others. And when a student came to me and told me what his topic was, I was afraid for him. I was worried that he was in a class of sharks and he didn't know, or he was going to take this risk and wouldn't be safe to take the risk. So Nelson and the dragon. Nelson is just this wonderful student. He's given me permission to share this story. So Nelson came to me and he said, I wanted to talk about dragons for my presentation. And I was so there for that. How exciting. And what a fun twist. Not what I was expecting at all. but we're in grade 10. And if there are sharks in the water, is this safe? Or am I putting you out there bleeding, or whatever, so that you're going to come and get chewed up? I didn't want that to happen. So Nelson was adamant. He was super excited to present. He would have gone the next day. He had a million visuals. He had so much expertise. He couldn't wait to get up there. But I suggested, okay, Nelson, let's think about your audience. How do we engage with this really authentic group, this really authentic performance? How do we make sure that they're not just listening and sitting back passively having to absorb this information? What can you do to make it fun for them? What can you do to engage? And so Nelson created a Kahoot, and he got up there to present, and he introduced his topic, and it was a total mic drop moment. And he said, I'm Nelson, I'm going to talk about dragons. And I'm not kidding, the class so spontaneously started applauding. It was just awesome. It was such a great thing to see. They were definitely not in shallow culture anymore. And he opened up the door for students who weren't sure about whether or not their topic was safe by taking this great risk and putting himself out there. So it was really an exciting community building, communication building, and empathy building process. His risk paid off for everyone, as everybody who went after him felt more safe and more comfortable to get up there and share what they loved. And so by the end, we just got to know each other to such a different degree than I usually do at the beginning of a class. And all because, a student was willing to take this risk and found a way to, develop the tools and the skills that they had into something that would be engaging for their audience. And what an authentic purpose. What a good reason to make these choices and make this game. So if we think about the containers involved there, that was definitely a speaking and viewing heavy container. So we didn't just stop there. We read about dragons and we wrote about dragons. We read Eustace Scrubb from the Voyage of the Dawn Treader and how he becomes a dragon and how he unbecomes a dragon. And then we decided to look for dragons in our houses and see what those were showing us. And we shared pictures of the dragons that were living in our bookshelves and our Netflix accounts and our siblings' toy boxes. We definitely took this to a next level when we did a representation map where we were illustrating dragons, but also connecting the literal and figurative qualities of them. So this theme became a huge focus for us, not the whole semester, but for most of it. We ended up doing The Hobbit, and it was something that was put out there as a risk and just became such a perfect fit with this, why do dark and twisty literature right now this year? It's all about the fantasy, a lot of fun for escapism. So that those initial containers can lead you in a direction of student interest, student strengths, but also to notice areas of maybe perceived deficiency or things that they don't feel very strong with. And you can start to fill those gaps with the containers that you have available to you with that inhale, exhale process. So we take them in and then we exhale the product. This is a huge list. This is not go home and spend your next 2 days going through every possibility here, but this might be a nice page to come back to once you have a few favorites and you're ready for another layer of challenge. So just some different ideas with how you might represent in digital ways and in person with physical ways. So representing some of my favorites have been Jamboard, which I've talked about a little bit already, sort of like a visual whiteboard or bulletin board where you can add sticky notes and pictures and some comments, but it's a really sort of a user-friendly but not super detailed version of things. So WebPaint will allow you to annotate live web pages and save it as a PDF or photo file. So that can be really nice, especially for social teachers doing, current events, or bio teachers looking at experiments that have happened out there. You can definitely annotate those web pages and then save your work so students can show you their findings in a very visual, physical way. Google Slides has some great features. Diagrams and smart art can create some really beautiful visual relationships. They are a little bit tough to use. There's a little bit of a learning curve, but once you have a sense of how to select the object, often there's a physical shape and then there's a text box within that. So if you have a sense of how to manipulate those, then those visual relationships are really easy to run and to use. I've had students make their own infographics using those before, and it's just a really user-friendly program for that. Google Drive mentioned. Google Sites is a nice one. Weebly is another good one if you'd like a little bit more functionality. Google's fairly basic but very user-friendly. Weebly is also user-friendly. It's a drag and drop platform, but if you get into the paid versions, it does definitely ramp up the availability, but also the complexity variability, or the complexity. So what you're able to do is great, but what you now have to figure out how to do might be a little overwhelming for beginners. Wix, even more so. That's a real, you're completely the designer and creator for the most part. There is some drag and drop sort of features, but you're really working on a space that you have complete control over, unlike Weebly, which will limit where you're able to add some of the features. Sway, I've talked about a little bit already, something to experiment with Microsoft if you're ready to move beyond PowerPoint and create some more learning pathways. Maker's boxes can be a lot of fun. We've got a wonderful construction teacher who has put a few of these together. So we have some tools that students can actually use, big glue guns and some of the things that they might put together to make a proto. Tableau can be a fun way to visually represent. It's really just posing, but posing for particular reasons. Visual essays or narratives using symbols or pictures or things that represent in a visual way that's not really writing heavy or maybe has just labeling rather than actual narrative or prose structures. Symbolic notation can be a lot of fun, especially if you're starting to work with the symbols that are emerging with all of the platforms coming out and all of the tech stuff. So what does that look like on a cell phone? What does the app screen look like? What can you do with all of those icons? For speaking, Google Meets, definitely. The breakout rooms are a lot of fun. And like I said, do we really need to be there for every student conversation? Probably not. Flipgrid is speaking, but with that added dynamic of visual representation with the viewability. Screencastify, as I'm using here, YouTube for vlogging. Do be cautious with the privacy settings there. So content produced for children has some different requirements. And if your students are sharing, they're going to want to probably have them set to private, and then they can share the link or password protect it as intended instead of putting themselves out there for the world to see. In person, speeches, monologues, dramatic readings, anything where you're able to tell the story verbally. We definitely are seeing with the TQS5 in our province, with the Truth and Reconciliation Council recommendations, this return to oral storytelling, and that can branch into all kinds of subject matter. It's not just for English. If you can explain it to a 6-year-old, you're an expert, and so why not put that to work in other places, that oral storytelling of the topic or the content. Writing, there's so many places to go for writing support on the internet. There's like a million containers out there. So some of the things that can come with this approach using these different containers are a real, opportunity to have some landscape learning in this process. So I know these are all 6 English strands, but as we think about those strands, how we can put these together and team up into maybe what I like to call class mashups or, collaborative learning experiences, even a user experience of school can be impacted by these container choices. So thinking about how you can use these containers might actually broaden how you're able to connect curriculum and content as well. For example, if you are thinking about the environment in Science 9, Social 10 might also be thinking about, environmental stewardship and some of the economics that go along with these concerns. So you might, depending on the size of school, depending on your scheduling, depending on your willingness of colleagues to do some mashups, you might have some opportunities to bring things together and have students create even more authentic products in these containers because of what they're able to connect. So as we move more and more away from discrete subject areas into sort of purposeful 21st century landscape learning, this is something that you might find more and more useful. And of course, for English teachers, our content is the containers. And so how do we execute these texts? How do we build text is really the focus, which means we can fill them with all kinds of things that are not necessarily just literature. So that's kind of a nice gift in our subject area. We can follow those students' passions for different subjects and still make it fit our needs with our curriculum and the requirements there. So thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate your time. I hope this session was helpful, at least in some way, whether you found one thing to take something off your plate or a variety of strategies to try. Awesome. I also have made some of the materials available for free on my Teachers Pay Teachers page that I've mentioned here, as well as on the Mighty Peace Convention site. So please do take advantage, make those your own, find ways to offer a variety of containers for your students so they can show their learning in more and more ways opportunities and build skills that maybe you haven't had a chance to explore in past times. Have fun. You are doing your best. Thanks so much. Have a great day.